Act 2. Symptoms in the Noise. Chapter 4. The Leak. The memo smelled like nothing, which somehow made it worse. Barnes had expected the leaked CDC file to carry some trace of fear even through the screen, a stain, an aura, some bureaucratic sweat trapped between margins. Instead, it sat there, with the sterile indifference of every government document that had ever tried to make catastrophe look manageable. Clean header bars, classification labels, polite spacing, a nice federal PDF wrapper around the sentence, "Something is wrong, and we are not prepared to name it in public." 3 hours had passed since the scanner traffic tipped from ugly to impossible. In that time, the rain had not stopped once. It had only changed its mind about intensity, like the sky was trying different methods of harassment. The safehouse basement took the weather in the same way it took everything else now, through concrete, through vibration, through the wet mineral smell that rose from the old walls and mixed with dust from the inverter, burnt coffee, cold electronics, gun oil, and the quiet insult of canned soup existing nearby. Barnes sat forward at the workstation, elbows on his knees, eyes red and dry in equal measure. CSI Linux glowed across one screen in a hard blue-white field that sharpened his face into angles. The other screen held the leaked PDF in a growing forensic workspace. His mug sat beside the keyboard, the ruined words "World's okayest investigator" only partly visible in the monitor light. He drank from it anyway because suffering had become routine and should never be allowed to feel ceremonial. Across the room, Ed was cleaning the lens of a flashlight with the corner of his thermal shirt, doing it with the same care he might have used on a rifle optic, a watch crystal, or a live grenade if anyone had forced him into increasingly bad metaphors. "You've read it 9 times, Ed said. 10. That helping? Not emotionally. That wasn't the question. Barnes didn't answer. He zoomed back into page 2 and stared at the redactions. Whoever had scrubbed the file had worked with urgency rather than artistry. The black bars were thick, obvious, and slightly misaligned in places, the digital equivalent of duct tape over a cracked windshield. That meant 2 things. First, whoever leaked the file had almost certainly done it fast. Second, somebody inside the system already knew enough to panic about wording before they panicked about consequence. He hated both. The title still sat at the top, like a bad joke written by committee. CDC Internal. Incident Assessment. Memo not for release. Preliminary Guidance. Acute febrile neurological presentation clusters. He had seen enough internal assessments in his life to know the genre. Institutions always wrote worst when they were most afraid. They turned human horror into language that could survive meetings, not because they were evil, not always, because if they wrote what things looked like, people reading them would have to imagine those things in rooms they controlled. And control was the first lie that mattered. Barnes exported the PDF into a sealed case folder and opened it inside a controlled project he had spun up less than 20 minutes earlier. Most people thought of autopsy as a dead drive tool. Barnes thought of it as a second opinion from a machine too patient to be embarrassed. Embedded objects, structural errors, metadata scars, image fragments, line spacing inconsistencies, object maps. PDF redaction was an art form practiced mostly by people who were bad at it, and institutional panic made people worse. He let the ingest run while he worked manually. "Tell me we're not at the part where the file itself becomes a crime scene," Ed said. "We are absolutely at that part." "Good. I'd hate to miss the fun." Barnes scrolled again. The visible language in the memo was already ugly enough without any reconstruction effort. Severe flu-like onset across 3 intake systems, fever, intermittent cough, disorientation. Then, in a subset of cases, rapid behavioral deterioration, agitation, confusion, extreme aggression, reduced pain response, and the phrase that had been bouncing around Barnes' skull since he first saw it half an hour ago. Oral fixation during restraint events. Institutional language was a horror genre all by itself. Below that, More visible fragments. Transmission vector undetermined. Exposure patterns may include direct fluid contact, multiple reports of assaultive behavior involving biting. Standard respiratory isolation may be insufficient pending further review. Ed leaned in, reading over his shoulder with the grudging patience of a man accepting that the apocalypse apparently came with paperwork. Direct fluid contact, he said. That means somebody already noticed blood or saliva. Yes. Biting makes that hard to miss. Also, yes. Ed was quiet for a second. Then, you think they know what it is? Barnes kept staring at the memo. I think they know what it isn't. That's supposed to comfort me. No. He copied the visible lines into the notes file and built a new section header. Institutional recognition. Confirmed. Atypical aggression, acknowledged internally. Biting, acknowledged internally. Respiratory isolation, already suspected insufficient. Public release, delayed pending classification certainty. Direct fluid exposure under active consideration. He hated how clean the list looked. Lists gave chaos a haircut, made it look ready for work. The sat phone buzzed once on the shelf behind him. Barnes snatched it up before the second vibration. The voice on the other end was the same one from earlier, clipped, tired, and more careful than Barnes enjoyed hearing from professionals who were supposed to know what shape the world still had. Internal authenticity confirmed, the voice said without greeting. No dispute. Barnes rolled his chair back with one foot, turned halfway toward Ed, and spoke without lowering his voice. The memo's real. Ed's face didn't change much, but the room did. That was how fear worked when it belonged to competent people. It didn't arrive in shouting. It entered like an adjustment to gravity. Anything else? Barnes asked. There's circulation of a second advisory draft, not finalized, restricted. I don't have the file. Read what you do have. Paper shifted faintly over the line. Then, transmission listed as unknown vector, suspected contact-based escalation. The safehouse went very still. Barnes typed the sentence exactly as spoken. Unknown vector. Suspected contact-based escalation. Ed stepped closer. Contact-based how? The voice answered carefully, in the tone of a man choosing every word as though each one might later testify against him. That's the argument. Flu-like entry point in some cases, but they're seeing events around blood, saliva, restraint injury, close quarters assault. Nobody wants to commit in writing beyond suspected. Barnes looked at the first memo, then the scanner logs, then the map he had built from symptom clustering, intake disruptions, and the eastward corridor that had started all this by refusing to behave like random civic decay. So, respiratory maybe, he said. But contact accelerates, or changes presentation, or secondary exposure behaves differently. Maybe. I hate maybe. You and everyone else. That got no laugh from anyone. What about mortality? Barnes asked. A pause. No stable answer. That's not useful. It's what I've got. Ed leaned toward the phone. Are they locking anything down? Not publicly. Privately. Another pause, longer. Movement restrictions are being discussed around medical hubs and transit overlap points. Nothing citywide. Barnes wrote that too. Hidden response posture. No public lockdown language. Internal movement controls under discussion. Transit/intake overlap identified as risk points. Public classification lag being preserved, intentionally or otherwise. Then he asked the question he already hated. Do they know there's a thread? Silence. Not confusion. Silence. The kind that told him the answer had shape in politics. Finally, I don't know who knows what beyond my lane, which meant yes, maybe, probably, and nobody wanted it attached to their name. The line died a second later. Barnes set the sat phone down and stared at the note file. Ed said, "You want me to say it?" "No. Because you know." Barnes rubbed at his eyes. "I know institutions are behind the event, behind the understanding of the event or behind the concealment of the event. I do not yet know which flavor of unforgivable I'm dealing with. That sounded like 3 ways to say we're in trouble. It was. Outside, the city performed another little failure. A heavy vehicle passed above the basement window, hissed through water, braked too hard, idled for 10 seconds, then moved again with the ugly indecision of people whose route had just changed, because some other route had become a sentence nobody wanted to finish. Barnes turned back to the PDF. This was the real work now, not reading the leak, breaking it open enough to understand what kind of minds had written it, what they already feared, and what they were still trying to hide from each other. He exported the raw object map, checked the XMP metadata, and started teasing at the redactions with the kind of patient malice years in digital forensics had taught him. Most scrubbed files stayed scrubbed, but panic made people sloppy and sloppiness left seams. He found the first seam on page 3. A blacked-out subsection under Handling Recommendations had shifted the paragraph below it by half a line. In the internal text object view, one fragment of an underlying sentence remained exposed like a bone through skin. No expectation of de-escalation once bite response initiates. Barnes stopped moving. Ed saw the change in his face instantly. What? Barnes read it aloud. Ed's jaw tightened. Bite response, he said, like it's a stage. Looks that way. Or a trigger. Barnes nodded once. Or both. He copied the fragment into the notes under a new section. Recovered hidden language. No expectation of de-escalation once bite response initiates no expectation of de-escalation. That was not public health caution language. That was behavioral expectation language. Somebody inside the response structure already believed that once the biting phase began, normal restraint and calming models no longer applied. The implications kept multiplying, and none of them improved his mood. He kept digging. Another remnant turned up 2 pages later, uglier because it was so clinical. A redaction over what looked like exposure guidance had left an object boundary scar. Most of the sentence was gone. 2 phrases remained, separated by blacked-out emptiness. Post-mortem activity not ruled out. Do not return remains until... Barnes stared at the screen without blinking. For a second, his mind rejected the sentence with the blunt physical refusal of a body declining poison. Ed said, Barnes. He didn't answer. Ed stepped closer and planted one hand on the back of the chair. Read it. Barnes swallowed and did. The flashlight lens in Ed's hand clicked softly against the desk when his fingers tightened. That's garbage, Ed said. Yes. That's bad redaction or bad wording or somebody's joke. Yes. You believe that? No. The word came out flatter than he intended. He copied the fragment anyway. Recovered hidden language. No expectation of de-escalation once bite response initiates. Post-mortem activity not ruled out. Do not return remains until redacted. The room seemed to shrink by an inch in every direction, not because Barnes believed every fragment immediately. He didn't. He wasn't stupid. False positives happened. Text remnants lied. Metadata drifted. Redactions obscured context and invited catastrophic readings. He had made a career out of distrusting what wanted him to react quickly. But the fragments did not exist in a vacuum. They existed beside the scanner call. What do you mean he's walking again? Beside the public health drift toward contact-based escalation. Beside hospitals quietly substituting euphemism for comprehension. Beside the hidden service thread, beside payload confirmed active. That was the sequence that mattered, not any one clue, the staircase they built together. Ed moved to the back shelf and began checking masks instead of speaking, which in him was not avoidance but pressure control. He counted filters under his breath, set 2 aside, checked the med kit, then said without looking up, "You still in innocent explanations mode?" Barnes gave the dead monitor a tired look. "I'm trying." "How's that going?" "Poorly." List them anyway. He hated that Ed knew to ask for that. He hated more that he was right. Barnes opened a fresh note pane. Forced alternatives, redaction artifact misread/context lost. Post-mortem activity may refer to involuntary movement after death, not functional reanimation. Do not return remains may be contamination control, not behavioral concern. Bite response may refer to patient aggression stage, not transmission stage. Scanner transmission may reflect panic distortion under stress. He read the list twice, then a third time, and felt each line lose mass in his head. It sounds worse when I'm being responsible, he said. That usually means your responsible version is still terrible. Yes? He saved the extracts to 3 locations, generated hashes, and mirrored the entire working set to the secondary drive. If the room became hostile in a hurry, he wanted at least 1 copy in each bag. Civilization reduced to evidence custody and bad instincts. The router gave a little electronic cough, recovered, then steadied. Connectivity was still there, if in the increasingly mean way all city services seemed to survive now, functional enough to keep betraying hope. Barnes reopened the hidden service thread. He had been trying not to refresh too often because obsession was unbecoming and also ineffective. But the room felt full of unfinished sentences now, and somewhere in that dark little coordination space, there were people measuring the city while hospitals still pretended they were having a difficult flu morning. The thread had moved again, not much. That was what made it worse. A small sequence from the same cluster. Tight, controlled, no triumph, no panic. The language of technicians watching a machine hit expected tolerances. Pharaoh_12. Clinical veil intact. Ash marrow, confirmed. Response lag within expected parameters. Vector winter. Public channels remain misclassified. Sable glass. Payload confirmed active. The room went silent in the complete and humiliating way only certain sentences could achieve. Barnes felt every beat of his pulse. There it was. Not another clue, not an inference, not a vocabulary mismatch he could still pretend belonged to metaphor. Payload confirmed active. No malware, no packet, no exploit chain, no coy technical misdirection left to hide behind. Whatever these people had released, measured, seeded, or staged, it was not a computer event. It was happening in bodies. Ed put one hand flat on the desk and leaned over the screen. Tell me. That means what it sounds like. Barnes kept staring at the words. It means I need a better hobby. Barnes. It means yes. Ed's hand stayed on the desk a second longer. Then he drew it back and looked toward the basement ceiling as if there might be somebody above them responsible for explaining the joke badly. There's your turning point, he said. Barnes blinked. What? The place where you stop being allowed to be polite. He wanted to argue. Couldn't. Because Ed was right. That was the pivot. The place where the mystery stopped being atmospheric and became accusation. Before those words, Barnes still had room to imagine exploit theater wrapped around public panic. Some hostile actor piggybacking a real outbreak. Some sophisticated rumor operation calibrating chaos to hide another crime. Still monstrous, still survivable in the categories he understood. After those words, the categories had changed. The thread was observing the outbreak as if it were a managed event, a payload, active, measured in response lag, veil, misclassification, public channels. The city was no longer merely collapsing. It was satisfying someone's design language. The scanner cracked alive beside the keyboard, louder this time, more overlap, less training. Security to pediatrics corridor. No, keep family back. He bit through the glove. What do you mean he's walking again? The feed dissolved into static and overlapping voices before the last line could finish, but it didn't matter. The room had heard enough. Neither man moved for nearly 5 seconds. Then Barnes was in motion. He dragged the memo, the thread captures, the recovered redaction fragments, the scanner logs, and the symptom cluster map into a new escalation bundle and began writing faster than his fear preferred. No throat clearing now. No careful softening. No professional euphemism designed to survive committee review. Leaked CDC internal memo confirms acute febrile neurological clusters with violent biting behavior and unknown transmission vector. Recovered redaction fragments suggest no de-escalation expectation after bite initiation and possible post-mortem activity concern. Hidden service coordination thread responding in real time with payload confirmed active and reference to public misclassification, strong indication of deliberate biological event or hostile exploitation of ongoing outbreak. Immediate restricted review recommended. Ed had already shifted into logistics, water, masks, trauma roll, ammunition, handhelds, a man preparing to leave a room before the room discovered it had become a trap. "Do we move?" he asked. Barnes stared at the transfer bar as it crawled toward the dead drop. "I don't know yet." "That's not a no." "No." "Then I pack like it isn't." "That sounds irritatingly reasonable." "It's one of my worst traits." On the monitor, the thread continued with its quiet self-satisfaction. Oxblood. Lower bands stable. Null harvest. Maintain observation discipline. Avoid premature commentary. Barnes laughed once, sharp and humorless. "Premature commentary. That's considerate." Ed slung a bag onto the table. "You want considerate, get a dog." Barnes pulled up the regional map again and started pinning every medical indicator they had. Official, unofficial, inferred. 3 clusters solid, 2 probable, 1 maybe. Spread enough to terrify, contained enough to confuse. Exactly the sort of early picture institutions loved mishandling because it still looked survivable from far away. He checked the clock. Not even noon. It felt much later in the life of the world. A clinic administrator's post flashed across a cached board. Temporary closure due to staffing illness. Please redirect non-critical patients. Then another from a pharmacy co-op. Limited antiviral stock. Delays expected. Then a school nurse channel transcript. 7 kids out with fever in the same block, and 1 tried to bite the aide. I need someone to tell me if that sentence is real. Barnes closed his eyes hard enough to see light. When he opened them, Ed was watching him with the expression of a man measuring whether another man was about to say something that would rearrange the room permanently. "Say it," Ed said. "They're ahead of the response curve," Barnes said. "Maybe by design, maybe because nobody wants to be first to say what this looks like." Ed nodded once. And if the people in that thread are seeing the same lag the hospitals are, then either they expected it or they built for it. The sat phone buzzed again before Ed could answer. Barnes hit connect. "Go," the voice said. "We confirmed internal authenticity on the CDC memo," Barnes replied. "Also likely hidden content indicating bite escalation and possible post-mortem concern." The paper-shifting silence on the other end lasted too long. Then, "Read that again." Barnes did. The voice swore under its breath. "There's quiet circulation of a second advisory draft that still hasn't been finalized. Whoever is scrubbing language is losing the fight." "Good," Barnes said. "I'd hate to think this was going smoothly." "What's the thread doing now?" "Treating public confusion like a milestone." Another pause. "You have enough to assume hostile coordination," the voice said. "I have enough to assume somebody wants the event hidden long enough to mature." "That's close enough." The line went dead without comfort. Barnes sat in the hum and rain and stared at the transfer confirmation. Institutional recognition, hidden knowledge, delayed public language, a thread that knew too much and spoke too calmly, a phrase that had just shifted the whole narrative out from under him. Payload confirmed active. It wasn't just another clue. It was the insult at the center of the story. The moment malware died and biology took its place. The city above them had not yet learned the full shape of what was happening. Hospitals were still reaching for the wrong nouns. Public health channels were still sanding down panic into terminology. Official advisories were still being born in secure folders like frightened bureaucratic larvae. But the people in the thread already knew. And in the basement, under rain and concrete and the weak holy light of overworked monitors, Barnes finally knew that they knew. That was worse. Because once you understood the outbreak and the hidden knowledge were running in parallel, every siren in the city stopped sounding reactive. They sounded late. He saved the bundle one more time. Not because he trusted redundancy to save them, because there are moments when preserving the shape of a crime becomes the only dignity left in a room. Outside, another siren rose and kept rising. And this time, the city did not sound confused. It sounded observed. Barnes did not refresh anything for a full 10 seconds after that. The memo sat on one screen. The thread sat on the other. The scanner whispered static between them like a bad conscience. For most of the morning, those three sources had still preserved a little professional distance from one another. The memo was institutional recognition. The thread was hostile foreknowledge. The scanner was lived chaos. Different rooms, different voices, different kinds of liability. Not anymore. Now, they were saying the same thing in different cowardices. The thread said, payload confirmed active. The memo said, acute febrile neurological presentation clusters and buried biting under polite federal phrasing. The scanner said, what do you mean he's walking again? 3 dialects, 1 event. Barnes opened a new note and wrote the question he should have asked earlier, because now every surviving fragment seemed to be answering it whether he liked the answers or not. What does the system already know that public language refuses to say? He sat with that line for a moment, then began pulling evidence beneath it. The memo knew biting was not incidental. The hidden fragment knew de-escalation ended once bite response began. The recovered redaction knew somebody had already written post-mortem activity, not ruled out inside a government document, and then panicked hard enough to black it out. The thread knew public channels would remain misclassified and treated that as a performance milestone. The scanner knew bodies were doing things after collapse that no hospital workflow had a moral vocabulary for. He typed each point into the notes, not because he needed the list, he could already feel it in the room, but because lists forced fear to sit still long enough to be useful. System knowledge/public refusal. Internal memo acknowledges biting, fluid contact, atypical aggression. Redaction fragment acknowledges no de-escalation after bite initiation. Redaction fragment acknowledges concern around post-mortem activity. Hidden service thread tracks public misclassification as operational advantage. Scanner traffic records impossible behavior before public language has caught up. Institutional response is already behind private knowledge. Ed read over his shoulder and said, that's one argument now. Yes. Good. No, Barnes said quietly. Just cleaner. That was the cost of convergence. Once the sources stopped feeling parallel, they stopped being spooky and became prosecutable. The thread was not merely predicting confusion. It was counting on institutions to spend one fatal hour trying to rename the thing before they admitted the thing had changed the room. The memo was not merely cautious. It was late. The scanner was not merely chaotic. It was reality arriving before procedure had finished dressing itself. Barnes turned back to the leaked PDF and zoomed in on the visible language again, forcing himself not to read it like a horror file, and instead read it like a bureaucratic confession. Exposure patterns may include direct fluid contact, meaning somebody had already watched ordinary proximity fail. Multiple reports of assaultive behavior involving biting, meaning somebody had already decided the word assaultive was less professionally humiliating than the word feeding. Standard respiratory isolation may be insufficient pending further review, meaning whatever this was, they had already seen it do something masks alone did not solve. He copied those visible lines beneath the redaction fragments and then placed the thread language beside them. Clinical veil intact. Response lag within expected parameters. Public channels remain misclassified. Payload confirmed active. The same structure appeared in both places. The institutions had one vocabulary for what they were willing to admit to themselves. The operators had another for what they expected the city to fail to understand. Neither vocabulary belonged to ordinary medicine anymore. That was the bridge. Not something bad is happening, not weird outbreak, but a coordinated asymmetry between private understanding and public naming. The event was maturing inside the lag. Ed moved to the shelf and started checking the go bags again, not full repack, just small adjustments, filters, batteries, trauma roll, water. The patient little gestures of a man translating theory into departure conditions. Barnes watched him for a second. "You've decided already," he said. Ed didn't look up. "No." That sounded false. It sounded practical. He zipped one pouch and came back to the desk. "We stay because the room still wins the math. But the math is changing, that all." Barnes nodded once. That was fair. He looked back at the question in the notes. What does the system already know that public language refuses to say? For the first time since the thread had surfaced, he answered it cleanly, line by line, without giving reality one more sentimental chance to remain polite. The system knew this was not flu. The system knew biting was not secondary noise. The system knew death was no longer a reliable exit condition in every case they cared about. The system knew contact was worsening the event faster than public advisories would admit. The system knew confusion was buying the outbreak time. And the system, or the people hiding inside it, was still choosing delay over honesty. He typed until the sentence looked almost obscene in its simplicity. Institutional recognition exists. Public recognition is being rationed. Ed read that one too. "Rationed," he said. That's mean. It's accurate." The scanner cracked alive again before either of them could say more. Not a full call this time, just a clipped security burst from somewhere deeper in the hospital net, voices stepping over each other, exhausted enough to stop sounding official. "Do not move the body. Keep the doors shut. Where is security?" Then the line dissolved into static and a burst of feedback sharp enough to make Barnes flinch. He stared at the receiver, the memo, the thread, the scanner. One argument. Not because they were identical, because they were now too consistent to remain separate. The memo said the institutions had seen enough to fear their own wording. The scanner said the field had already outrun that wording. The thread said someone had expected exactly that sequence and built for it. That was the true leak. Not the PDF. The gap. Barnes opened one last file and titled it with the grim little satisfaction of a man who finally knows which wound belongs to which weapon. Classification. Failure as delivery mechanism. He did not yet know if that line would survive the next chapter or the next day. He knew only that it fit the evidence better than any gentler phrase still alive in the room. Ed looked at the title, then at Barnes. "You naming the crime now. I'm naming the method. That better?" "No," Barnes said. "Just further along." Outside, the city kept worsening by intervals. Tires through water. A door slammed somewhere above street level. Then a cry cut off too abruptly to be resolved as argument. Then another siren joining the low, wet chorus already crawling across the area. Barnes saved the bundle again, mirrored it again, printed the question and the answer, because his body still trusted paper more than systems, and because spite was sometimes the only dignity left to technicians. He pinned the new sheet beside the map. What does the system already know that public language refuses to say? This is not ordinary illness. Biting is operationally significant. Contact worsens the event. Death does not reliably remove the subject. Public misclassification is extending the damage. He stepped back from the wall and looked at the room as a whole. Dead monitor glow, rain-stained concrete, shelf inventory, bag weight, pinned paper, the ugly little monastery of a city trying to think before it had to move. Then he looked at Ed. "The next thing won't be language," he said. Ed nodded once. "No." Barnes glanced toward the screen where Mercy West was thinning into fragments, and the thread had gone quiet again, satisfied and obscene. "It'll be proof." And 90 minutes later, the first body refused to stay in its category.